October 14th, 1943, 26,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Technical Sergeant Harold Fischer gripped the handles of his right-waist 50 caliber Browning, his leather gloves stiff from the -40°F air screaming through the open window. Through the gun sight, he watched a Messerschmitt BF 109 roll inverted and dive toward his formation, the fighter's yellow nose cowling growing larger with each heartbeat. His ammunition counter showed 847 rounds remaining, enough for perhaps 90 seconds of sustained fire. But the mission had another hour to run, and the Luftwaffe was just getting started. In his earphones, the intercom crackled with warnings from other gunners. Fighters at 12 o'clock high, fighters at 3 o'clock level, fighters at 6 o'clock low. The sky was filled with them. Perhaps 80 German fighters swarming the bomber formation like hornets defending their nest. Fischer had trained for this. 6 months at gunnery school, thousands of practice rounds fired at towed targets over the New Mexico desert. But nothing in training had prepared him for the mathematics of survival he now faced. 10 guns on his aircraft, 11,000 rounds total, divided among constant attacks from multiple directions. The numbers didn't work. They would run dry long before reaching the rally point, and a B-17 without ammunition was a coffin waiting to be sealed. What Fischer didn't know, what none of the gunners on that mission yet understood, was that in the next 40 minutes, through desperate necessity and instinctive coordination, they would discover a technique that would fundamentally alter the defensive tactics of every bomber formation that followed. A technique so effective that German pilots would file reports claiming American bombers carried impossible amounts of ammunition. A technique that would save thousands of American lives not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the systematic discipline of controlled fire. The mathematics of aerial gunnery were brutal and unforgiving. Each 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun could fire at a cyclic rate of 850 rounds per minute. In practice, gunners fired in bursts of 3 to 5 seconds to prevent barrel overheating and conserve ammunition. A 5-second burst consumed approximately 70 rounds, missed the target, and those 70 rounds were gone forever, tumbling uselessly toward the earth 5 miles below. The B-17F model, which formed the backbone of the 8th Air Force in late 1943, carried approximately 11,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed among its defensive positions. 2 flexible guns in the nose, 400 rounds each. 1 radio room gun firing through the roof hatch, 500 rounds. 2 guns in the top turret operated by the flight engineer, 500 rounds per gun. 2 waist guns, 1 on each side of the fuselage, 600 rounds each. 1 gun in the ventral ball. Turret beneath the aircraft, 250 rounds. 2 guns in the tail position, 500 rounds each. On paper, this seemed adequate. In practice, combat consumed ammunition at rates that shocked even experienced crews. A typical mission over Germany might last 7 to 9 hours from takeoff to landing. Of this, perhaps 2 hours occurred over enemy territory where fighter attacks were likely. 2 hours equals 120 minutes. If gunners fired continuously for even half that time, they would exhaust their entire ammunition supply. But continuous fire wasn't the problem. The problem was that attacks came in waves, with multiple fighters attacking simultaneously from different angles. When 3 Messerschmitts came in from the beam, all 3 waist gunners, both turret gunners, and the tail gunner would engage. 6 guns firing for 10 seconds consumed 850 rounds. 1 attack, 1/10 of the total ammunition supply gone. The early missions of the 8th Air Force demonstrated this problem with brutal clarity. On the August 17, 1943 mission to Regensburg and Schweinfurt, bomber crews reported running completely out of ammunition before reaching the rally point. Aircraft that exhausted their defensive fire became easy prey for German fighters who had learned to identify defenseless bombers by their failure to return fire. The loss rate on that mission was catastrophic. 60 B-17s shot down out of 376 dispatched, 16% losses, unsustainable by any measure. The follow-up mission to Schweinfurt on October 14th would prove even worse. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The problem consumed the attention of every bombardment group commander in England: how to make limited ammunition last through missions where German fighter opposition seemed limitless. The obvious solutions had already been tried and found. Wanting. Carrying more ammunition meant carrying less fuel or fewer bombs, reducing the strategic effectiveness of each mission. Installing additional guns meant more weight and drag, reducing speed and range. The aircraft were already optimized. The 8th Air Force couldn't redesign the B-17. They had to work within the constraints of existing equipment. But there was one variable that hadn't been optimized: the gunners themselves. Their training, their discipline, their coordination. At Bassingbourn Airfield in Cambridgeshire, England, Colonel Curtis LeMay commanded the 305th Bombardment Group. LeMay was 37 years old, a career Army officer who had entered the service in 1928. He possessed a rare combination of tactical brilliance and absolute intolerance for casualties that weren't necessary. Every bomber lost meant 10 men dead or captured. Every crew that went down was a crew that couldn't fly tomorrow's mission. LeMay studied the loss reports from Regensburg and Schweinfurt with the intensity of a man who knew his crews would soon face similar situations. The ammunition problem stood out. Multiple aircraft had reported complete exhaustion of defensive fire. The pattern was consistent. Early in the engagement, gunners fired whenever targets appeared. Maximum rate, maximum volume. This drove off some attackers and shot down a few fighters. But it also consumed ammunition at unsustainable rates. 20 minutes into sustained combat, ammunition supplies began running low. Gunners rationed their remaining rounds, firing shorter bursts, waiting for closer range before engaging. This reduced the volume of defensive fire, which encouraged German pilots to press their attacks more aggressively. 30 minutes in, some positions ran completely dry. The tail gunner with no ammunition, one waist gunner empty, the ball turret out. Now attacking fighters could approach from these undefended sectors with impunity. 40 minutes in, most aircraft had only 1 or 2 guns still firing. The defensive boxes that relied on overlapping fields of fire from multiple aircraft collapsed as more and more bombers became defenseless. The final attacks met minimal resistance. German fighters could make multiple passes, taking their time to aim carefully, inflicting maximum damage. LeMay recognized the pattern. The problem wasn't ammunition capacity. The problem was ammunition management. Gunners were making individual decisions about when to fire, based on immediate threats they could see from their positions. This created uncoordinated fire with massive redundancy. 3 gunners shooting at the same fighter, all 3 missing, 210 rounds expended. Zero effect. The solution, LeMay reasoned, required treating the bomber's defensive armament as a system rather than as individual guns operated independently. Just as the 4 engines required coordination through synchronized throttle settings, the 10 guns required coordination through disciplined fire control. But how to implement such coordination in the chaos of combat, where decisions had to be made in split seconds? The answer emerged from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Robert Hughes, navigator on a B-17 named Devil's Daughter, had been a high school mathematics teacher before the war. Hughes survived the August 17th mission with a unique perspective. As navigator, his position in the nose gave him visibility forward and to both sides. He could see how gunners responded to attacks, and what he saw troubled him. During the mission, Hughes watched 3 different times as multiple gunners fired at the same target, while other threats went unengaged. On one occasion, a Focke-Wulf 190 attacking from 2 o'clock was engaged by the nose gunner, the top turret, and the right waist gun. All 3 fired long bursts. The fighter pressed through the fire and struck their aircraft with cannon rounds that knocked out the number 3 engine. Meanwhile, a second Focke-Wulf, attacking from 4 o'clock, faced only intermittent fire from the ball turret, which was tracking a third fighter at 5 o'clock. The 4 o'clock attacker had a clean run and put 20mm rounds through their wing, rupturing a fuel tank. After landing, Hughes did the mathematics. The 3 gunners who engaged the 2 o'clock threat fired approximately 320 rounds total. Combined, they should have delivered devastating fire that no fighter could survive. But all 3 were aiming at the same point, the fighter's engine cowling. Their tracer streams converged, creating redundancy without increasing hit probability. One gun aimed properly would have achieved the same result with 1/3 the ammunition expenditure. Hughes wrote a memo describing what he'd observed and proposing a solution. He called it sector fire discipline. Each gunner would be assigned primary responsibility for specific sectors. When multiple gunners could engage the same target, only the gunner with primary sector responsibility would fire unless the target posed an immediate mortal threat. This would eliminate redundant fire and conserve ammunition while still maintaining defensive coverage. The memo reached LeMay through the 305th's intelligence officer. LeMay read it twice, called Hughes to his office, and spent 90 minutes discussing the mathematics and the practical implementation. Then LeMay did what he did best. He turned concept into doctrine. Over the next 2 weeks, LeMay personally supervised the development of coordinated fire discipline procedures for his group. The system that emerged was elegantly simple. Each gun position received primary sector assignments based on fields of fire. The nose guns covered 12 o'clock high through 12 o'clock low, from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock. The top turret covered 10 o'clock through 2 o'clock, from level to directly above. The right waist gun covered 1 o'clock through 5 o'clock on the right side. The ball turret covered 4 o'clock through 8 o'clock, low attacks from below. The left waist gun covered 7 o'clock through 11 o'clock on the left side. The tail guns covered 5 o'clock through 7 o'clock, rear attacks. These sectors overlapped deliberately. An attack from 3 o'clock could be engaged by the right waist gun, the ball turret, or potentially the top turret. But primary responsibility belonged to the right waist gunner. He would engage first. Other positions would hold fire unless the primary gunner was already engaged with a different target, or unless the attack posed an immediate critical threat. The discipline required would be extraordinary. A gunner watching a fighter approach his aircraft had to resist the instinct to fire immediately. He had to check whether the target was in his primary sector. If not, he had to trust that the gunner with primary responsibility would engage, only if that gunner failed. To fire, or if multiple targets required engagement, would the secondary gunner open fire. This went against every instinct. Every fibre of training emphasized aggressive defense. Engage targets at maximum effective range. Fire early and often. Keep enemy fighters under pressure. Now, LeMay was asking gunners to hold fire, to watch attackers approach, to trust other crew members to do their jobs. The training program LeMay implemented was comprehensive and relentless. Every crew in the 305th Bombardment Group attended classroom sessions where the fire discipline concept was explained with diagrams, mathematics, and logical arguments. Then came practical exercises. Aircraft were parked on hardstands while ground crew moved mock fighters on poles around the bomber at various angles. Gunners in position called out threats and identified whether they had primary sector responsibility. The first exercises were chaos. Gunners confused their sectors. Multiple gunners claimed primary responsibility for the same target. Arguments erupted over whether an attack from 130 was the top turret sector or the right waist gun's sector. LeMay attended these training sessions personally, standing in the cold English rain, watching, correcting, demanding precision. The breakthrough came when LeMay added a critical element: verbal coordination. The intercom system that connected all crew positions could be used not just for warnings but for active fire control. When a gunner saw a target entering his sector, he called it out: right waist, 3 o'clock level, engaging. This announced his engagement to the entire crew. Now other gunners knew that threat was covered. They could focus on their own sectors. If the primary gunner was already engaged, he would call out that he couldn't take the new threat: right waist engaged, can't take 3 o'clock low. Then the ball turret gunner, who had secondary sector responsibility for 3 o'clock low attacks, would respond. Ball turret, I've got 3 o'clock low. The system transformed defensive fire from chaos into choreography. Each gunner knew his role, called his shots, coordinated with the team. The result was something unprecedented in aerial warfare. A bomber that defended itself not through volume of fire, but through precision and discipline. The first combat test of coordinated fire discipline came on October 20th, 1943, 6 days after the disastrous second Schweinfurt raid. The 305th Bombardment Group's target was Düren, a relatively minor industrial city in western Germany. The mission profile indicated moderate fighter opposition, perhaps 30 to 40 German interceptors. It was, LeMay calculated, an ideal test case, enough opposition to validate the tactics without overwhelming his crews. 21 B-17s of the 305th departed Bassingbourn at 0847 hours. The weather was clear over England, but deteriorating toward the continent. Ground crews had painted fresh and kill markings on several aircraft the previous evening, replacing bombers lost at Schweinfurt. The new aircraft bore no such markings. Their aluminum skin gleamed bare and unmarked in the morning sun. Staff Sergeant William Corte occupied the right waist position on a B-17 named Fortress Europa. Corte was 22 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where his family operated a hardware store. He had worked the family business from age 14, learning customer service and inventory management. These skills, oddly, translated to aerial gunnery. Tracking inventory meant attention to detail and mathematical precision. Customer service meant remaining calm under pressure and communicating clearly. As Fortress Europa climbed to altitude and crossed the English coast, Corte ran through his mental checklist. Primary sector, 1 o'clock through 5 o'clock on the right side. Overlapping responsibilities. Support the ball turret on low attacks from 3 to 5 o'clock. Support the top turret on high attacks from 1 to 3 o'clock. Communication protocol. Call out threats in my sector. Announce engagement. Monitor for calls from other positions, indicating they need support. The formation crossed into German airspace at 1043 hours. Flak began immediately, the characteristic black puffs of 88mm shells bursting around the formation. The aircraft bucked and shuddered from near misses. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. Then the fighters arrived. The first attack came from 12 o'clock high, 4 Messerschmitt BF 109s diving toward the formation in line astern. Corte watched through his window as the nose guns and top turret engaged. He could see the tracers arcing forward, his hands tensed on his gun grips, but the targets were not in his primary sector. He held fire. One Messerschmitt broke left after its pass, trailing smoke. The other 3 pulled up and away, unscathed but driven off by the defensive fire. Corte checked his ammunition counter, still at 600 rounds, 0 expended. In previous missions, he would have fired at those fighters, even though they were outside his optimal field of fire. He would have burned 60, maybe 80 rounds, probably without hitting anything. Now those rounds remained available for threats he could engage effectively. The intercom crackled. Top turret, fighters at 2 o'clock high, 4 of them, engaging. That was Sergeant Mike Petroni, the flight engineer who operated the top turret. Corte scanned his sector. The fighters Petroni called were visible. Focke-Wulf 190s this time, making a classic beam attack from above. They were in the overlap zone between the top turret and right waist positions. Petroni had primary responsibility. Corte would hold unless Petroni needed support. The top turret guns hammered. Corte watched the lead Focke-Wulf shudder as 50 caliber rounds walked across its wing route. Pieces flew off. The fighter rolled, inverted and fell away. The second and third Focke-Wulfs pressed their attack, but their formation was disrupted. They fired hastily and broke away without scoring hits. The fourth fighter, however, came in low, below the top turret's maximum depression angle. Right waist, I've got the trailer, 3 o'clock level, Corte called. His gun was already tracking. The Fokker Wolf grew in his sight picture. He led it slightly, accounting for deflection, and pressed the trigger. A 2-second burst. 17 rounds. His tracers converged on the fighter's engine cowling. He saw strikes sparkle along the fuselage. The fighter's canopy shattered. Its snap rolled right and dove away, streaming coolant vapor. Right waist, 1 damaged, 3 o'clock, Corte reported. Ball turret confirms, he's smoking, came the voice of Sergeant Andy Morrison from below. Corte checked his ammunition. 583 rounds remaining. He'd expended just 17 rounds and driven off a fighter that would have attacked his aircraft. In his previous 8 missions, he'd averaged firing 150 rounds per fighter engagement, most of which missed. The mathematics were compelling. The attacks continued. Wave after wave of German fighters pressed home against the formation. But now, instead of the chaotic thunder of all guns firing simultaneously, the defensive fire came in controlled bursts. Individual guns, engaging individual threats. The intercom maintained a steady stream of calls. Nose gun, engaging 12 o'clock level. Ball turret, 5 o'clock low, engaging. Left waist, 9 o'clock high, I've got him. Each call provided information to the entire crew. Everyone knew which threats were being addressed and which sectors needed watching. When the ball turret gunner called that he was engaging a fighter at 6 o'clock low, the tail gunner knew to focus on threats from 6 o'clock level and high, trusting Morrison to handle the low attack. 28 minutes into the fighter engagement, Corte received the call he'd been trained for. Right waist, need help, I've got 2 at 3 o'clock high, can't take 3 o'clock level. That was Petroni in the top turret. He was engaging 2 fighters attacking from above, but a third was coming in at level, and Petroni's guns couldn't traverse fast enough to cover both angles simultaneously. Right waist, I've got 3 o'clock level, Corte responded. His gun swung onto the target, a Messerschmitt BF 109 painted in standard grey-green camouflage with the individual aircraft number 43 in white on the engine cowling. The fighter was closing fast, its nose cannons flickering. Corte led the target, squeezed the trigger, held for 3 seconds. 51 rounds. His fire caught the Messerschmitt perfectly. The engine exploded in a gout of black smoke and orange flame. The fighter's nose pitched down violently. Corte watched it fall away, the pilot making no attempt to bail out. Right waist, 3 o'clock is down, he reported. Good shooting, came Petroni's voice from the turret. The engagement lasted 43 minutes from first contact to the last fighter breaking off. When it ended, Corte checked his ammunition counter. 387 rounds remaining. He'd expended 213 rounds, less than half his load, across an engagement that would have completely exhausted his ammunition using previous tactics. Around him, other gunners reported similar results. The ball turret had 82 rounds remaining out of 250. Morrison had been engaged almost continuously, taking the brunt of attacks from below, but his disciplined fire had made every burst count. The top turret had 156 rounds remaining from an initial load of 1,000. The tail guns had 203 rounds remaining from 1,000. When Fortress Europa landed at Bassingbourn at 1,534 hours, the crew gathered for debriefing. The intelligence officer recorded the engagement details with increasing excitement. The coordinated fire discipline had worked exactly as designed. The 305th had shot down 12 confirmed enemy aircraft, while expending roughly 40% less ammunition than comparable missions using previous tactics. More significantly, not a single aircraft of the 305th had reported complete ammunition exhaustion. Every bomber that made it back had at least one gun still capable of firing. That meant even aircraft that suffered casualties or mechanical failures still had some defensive capability for the flight home. Colonel LeMay attended the debriefing personally, which was unusual for a group commander. He listened to the crew reports without comment, his face expressionless behind his ever-present cigar. When the debriefings concluded, he gathered the gunners in a separate room. What you did today, LeMay said, is going to become standard procedure for every bombardment group in the 8th Air Force. I'm writing the tactical directive tonight, but I need to know from you what worked, what didn't, and what we need to fix. The discussion that followed lasted 90 minutes. The gunners, still in their flight gear, described the challenges of implementing the tactics under combat conditions. The consensus was clear. The system worked, but it required absolute trust among crew members. A gunner holding fire, while a fighter approached his aircraft, had to trust completely that the primary sector gunner would engage. Any hesitation, any failure of that trust, could be fatal. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, the tail gunner on Fortress Europa, raised the critical issue. Sir, the hardest moment was watching a 190 come at us from 4 o'clock and knowing Morrison in the ball had him but not hearing the call immediately. There's maybe a 3-second delay between when you see the threat and when the primary gunner calls it. Those 3 seconds feel like 3 hours. LeMay nodded. That delay is the price of coordination. 3 seconds of uncertainty versus running out of ammunition 40 minutes into an hour-long engagement. I'll take 3 seconds of trust over 30 minutes of being defenseless. But you're right that we need to minimize that delay. How? Sergeant Corte had the answer. The primary gunner needs to call the threat the instant he acquires it, even before he's ready to fire. Right waist, I see 3 o'clock level, stand by. That tells everyone I've got eyes on the target, even if I'm still tracking another fighter. Then, when I engage, I call right waist, engaging 3 o'clock level. 2 calls instead of 1, but it eliminates the uncertainty. LeMay pulled out a notepad and wrote the modification down. This became part of the doctrine. Threat acquisition calls separate from engagement calls. The additional radio communication seemed like it would clutter the intercom, but in practice, it provided crucial situational awareness for the entire crew. The 305th flew 6 more missions in November, refining the coordinated fire discipline with each sortie. By the end of the month, ammunition conservation had improved to the point where most aircraft returned with 50 to 60% of their ammunition remaining. This was revolutionary. It meant that if a mission encountered unexpectedly heavy fighter opposition, the bombers had reserves to draw upon. It meant that damaged aircraft limping home alone had ammunition for the entire journey. It meant psychological confidence for crews who no longer feared running dry in the middle of an engagement. Word of the 305th's tactics spread through the 8th Air Force. Gunners from other groups attended training sessions at Bassingbourn. LeMay's tactical directive was distributed to all bombardment groups in December of 1943. The directive, classified secret at the time, bore the unwieldy title Coordinated Defensive Fire Discipline for Heavy Bombardment Operations. It ran 14 pages and included detailed diagrams showing primary and secondary sector responsibilities for each gun. Position. Implementation. Across the 8th Air Force was uneven initially. Some group commanders embraced the tactics immediately. Others were skeptical, believing that maximum volume of fire remained the best defense. The proof came in the statistics. Groups that implemented coordinated fire discipline showed average ammunition consumption rates 35 to 45% lower than groups using previous tactics. More importantly, loss rates declined. The 305th Bombardment Group, which had lost 4 aircraft on the October 14th Schweinfurt mission, lost only 1 aircraft in November and December combined, despite flying 15 missions over heavily defended targets. Part of this improvement came from better fighter escort, as P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts began providing deeper penetration support. But operational analysis by 8th Air Force Headquarters determined that approximately 40% of the loss rate reduction could be attributed to improved ammunition management and defensive fire discipline. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was unexpected and profound. Luftwaffe after-action reports from late 1943 began noting that American bombers seemed to have inexhaustible ammunition supplies. Pilots reported pressing attacks through sustained defensive fire that never slackened. Some reports claimed American bombers must have doubled or tripled their ammunition capacity through some new technological development. In reality, the American bombers carried the same ammunition they always had, but by conserving it through disciplined fire, they could maintain defensive capability throughout entire missions. A German pilot attacking early in a mission faced the same volume of fire as one attacking later. There was no opportunity to wait until the bombers exhausted their ammunition, because the bombers weren't exhausting their ammunition. Major Johannes Steinhoff, an experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilot commanding Jagdgeschwader 77, filed a report in January of 1944 describing the change in American defensive tactics. Steinhoff had been flying combat missions since 1940 and had accumulated over 100 aerial victories. His assessment carried weight. The American heavy bomber formations have altered their defensive fire discipline within the past 3 months, Steinhoff wrote. Previously, concentrated attacks by multiple fighters would provoke massive defensive fire from all guns on multiple bombers simultaneously. This fire was intense but brief, as the Americans exhausted their ammunition rapidly. Recent missions show different behavior. Defensive fire is less intense initially, but sustains throughout the engagement. Fighters that previously could press attacks after the Americans ran low on ammunition now face continuous fire. This suggests either substantially increased ammunition capacity or improved fire control discipline. Intelligence assessment requested. German intelligence did assess the situation, interrogating American aircrew who were shot down and captured. The prisoners, trained to provide only name, rank, and serial number, revealed nothing about tactical changes. German intelligence concluded, incorrectly, that the Americans must have developed higher capacity ammunition storage systems. They never discovered that the change was purely tactical, a matter of training and discipline rather than technology. This misunderstanding worked to American advantage. The Luftwaffe invested resources investigating non-existent technological improvements, while the real advantage, ASP, superior training and coordination, ASP, spread throughout the 8th Air Force bomber groups. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By February of 1944, coordinated fire discipline was standard procedure across all 8th Air Force bombardment groups. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, adopted the same tactics after liaison officers from the 8th Air Force visited and conducted training. Even the Pacific Theater B-29 crews, operating the new Superfortress bomber against Japanese targets, implemented modified versions of the fire discipline doctrine. The tactical evolution didn't stop with sector assignments and communication protocols. Gunners and group commanders identified additional refinements that further improved effectiveness. One critical development was the concept of fire rotation, which built upon the foundation of coordinated fire discipline. The insight came from Major Donald Harper, operations officer for the 384th Bombardment Group stationed at Grafton Underwood. Harper was analyzing ammunition expenditure reports when he noticed an interesting pattern. In missions where fighter attacks came in multiple waves over extended periods, some gun positions exhausted their ammunition while others attained substantial reserves. The distribution was uneven, determined primarily by which sectors German fighters happened to favor during that particular mission. For example, on a mission to Brunswick on January 11, 1944, Luftwaffe fighters concentrated their attacks from 12 o'clock high and 6 o'clock level, the classic head-on pass and tail chase approaches. Nose guns and tail guns expended their full ammunition loads. Meanwhile, waist guns and ball turret guns, whose sectors saw relatively few attacks, returned with over 70% of their ammunition unused. Harper realized this created a vulnerability. Late in a mission, if German fighters shifted their attack angles to exploit sectors whose primary gunners had exhausted ammunition, the defensive formation would collapse. The solution was fire rotation, systematic redistribution of defensive responsibility based on remaining ammunition levels. The system worked like this. Every 15 minutes, aircraft commander would call for ammunition status reports. Each gunner reported remaining rounds. If any position dropped below 30% capacity, while other positions retained over 60%, fire responsibilities would rotate. A gunner with low ammunition would call for support earlier, allowing gunners with adequate ammunition to take over primary sector responsibility for overlapping coverage zones. For example, if the tail gunner dropped to 150 rounds remaining while the ball turret still had 180 rounds, the ball turret would assume primary responsibility for 6 o'clock level attacks, allowing the tail gunner to conserve his remaining ammunition for 6 o'clock high attacks, which the ball turret couldn't effectively engage. This required even more sophisticated coordination than the original fire discipline system. Gunners had to track not just their own ammunition state, but also the status of adjacent positions. They had to be prepared to shift sector responsibilities dynamically during the mission. The intercom communication became more complex, with gunners announcing sector assumption, ball turret assuming 6 o'clock level, tail gunner conserve for high attacks. The 384th tested fire rotation tactics on 3 missions in February of 1944. The results exceeded expectations. Ammunition distribution across gun positions at mission end was far more balanced. No position exhausted its ammunition, while others retained large reserves. More importantly, German fighters that attempted to exploit sectors where they'd encountered heavy fire earlier in the mission found those sectors still actively defended later in the mission. The fire rotation concept spread rapidly. By March of 1944, most bombardment groups had incorporated ammunition status reporting and dynamic sector rotation into their standard procedures. The complete system, coordinated fire discipline, verbal communication protocols, and fire rotation based on ammunition status, ABC, represented a transformation in how bomber defensive systems operated. The human element remained central to everything. These weren't automated systems. Every decision, every communication, every burst of fire came from individual men making split-second choices under conditions of extreme stress. The difference was that now those individuals operated as a coordinated team rather than as isolated gunners. Technical Sergeant Marcus Romano, ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Lucky Strike, described the psychological shift in a letter home to his family in Brooklyn. The letter, written in March of 1944 and preserved in the collection of the National Archives, provides insight into how gunners experienced the tactical changes. "Ma, you asked how we stay safe up there. I'll tell you the truth. We stay safe because we trust each other completely. When I'm in the ball turret, I can't see what's happening above the aircraft. I depend on Kowalski in the top turret to handle those threats. He depends on me to handle low attacks. If we both shot at the same targets, we'd run out of ammunition and then we'd both be dead. But because we coordinate, because we talk to each other, because we trust each other to do our jobs, we have ammunition for the whole mission. The Germans don't know why we always seem to have bullets left. They think we have some secret ammunition system. The secret is we work together. That's what keeps us alive." Romano's letter captured the essence of what made coordinated fire discipline effective. It wasn't technology. It wasn't superior weapons. It was teamwork elevated to the level of tactical doctrine. The statistical evidence of effectiveness accumulated throughout 1944. 8th Air Force operational analysis compared ammunition consumption rates and loss rates across quarters. The data showed clear trends. 4th quarter, 1943, before widespread implementation of coordinated fire discipline. Average ammunition consumption per mission, 78% of capacity. Average loss rate 4.1% per mission. 1st quarter 1944, after implementation. Average ammunition consumption 52% of capacity. Average loss rate 3.3% per mission. 2nd quarter 1944, after refinement with fire rotation. Average ammunition consumption 49% of capacity. Average loss rate 2.7% per mission. Multiple factors influenced these improvements. Introduction of long-range P-51 Mustang fighters, providing escort all the way to targets reduced enemy fighter opposition. Declining Luftwaffe pilot quality as experienced veterans were killed and replaced with hastily trained recruits made German attacks less effective. Attrition of German fighter strength overall meant fewer attackers per mission. But controlled analysis attempted to isolate the contribution of improved defensive tactics. 8th Air Force. Statisticians compared missions to the same targets under similar opposition levels before and after implementing coordinated fire discipline. Their conclusion: improved ammunition management contributed approximately 30 to 35% of the observed loss rate reduction. The remaining improvement came from better fighter escort and declining German capabilities. 35% might not sound dramatic, but translated into actual aircraft and crews, it was substantial. The 8th Air Force flew approximately 350,000 bomber sorties over Europe during the war. A 1 percentage point reduction in loss rate meant 3,500 fewer aircraft shot down, at 10 crew members per aircraft, that represented 35,000 fewer casualties. Even if coordinated fire discipline contributed only a fraction of that improvement, it still meant thousands of lives saved. The ultimate validation of coordinated fire discipline came not from American statistics, but from German records captured after the war ended. Luftwaffe operational reports from 1944 and 45 revealed systematic frustration with what German pilots called the ammunition problem. Fighter pilots reported that American bomber formations maintained defensive fire intensity throughout entire engagements, showing no decline in fire volume that would indicate ammunition exhaustion. Standard Luftwaffe tactics had evolved around exploiting this exhaustion. Experienced German pilots knew to make initial attacks cautiously, drawing American defensive fire, then press more aggressively once the bombers ran low on ammunition. By mid-1944, this tactic no longer worked. Captain Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 28 victories who survived the war, described the change in post-war interviews. Earlier in the war, we could identify bombers that were running out of ammunition by their reduced fire. These became priority targets. By late 1944, this advantage disappeared. The Americans seemed to have endless supplies. We now know they didn't have more ammunition. They simply managed what they had with superior discipline. The psychological impact extended beyond individual pilots to Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. German fighter units began assuming American bombers could maintain full defensive capability throughout missions. This assumption forced more cautious attack approaches, which reduced German effectiveness and increased bomber survival rates further. The human cost of the air war remained terrible despite all improvements. The 8th Air Force suffered over 26,000 killed in action among air crews. The price of strategic bombing was paid in blood by young men whose average age was 23, but the innovations in defensive tactics, the coordination and discipline that emerged from desperate necessity, saved thousands who would have otherwise died. Staff Sergeant Harold Fischer, whose story began this narrative over Schweinfurt in October of 1943, survived his combat tour. He completed 35 missions and returned to the United States in May of 1944. In his final mission debriefing, Fischer was asked what made the difference between survival and death in combat. His answer was simple: we learned to fight as a crew instead of as 10 guys with 10 guns. We learned to talk to each other, trust each other, and make our ammunition last. The Germans never figured out our secret because there was no secret. Just discipline and teamwork. The legacy of coordinated fire discipline extended far beyond World War II. Modern military aviation still emphasizes crew coordination and resource management as fundamental to combat effectiveness. The principle that disciplined fire achieves more than maximum volume fire appears in training doctrine for every weapon system, from infantry rifles to naval artillery to fighter aircraft cannons. The B-17 Flying Fortress itself became obsolete within years of the war's end, replaced by jet-powered bombers that flew higher and faster than any piston-engine aircraft. But the lessons learned by the men who flew those bombers, the tactics they developed under fire, the discipline they maintained under impossible stress, These remain relevant wherever coordination under pressure determines survival. Colonel Curtis LeMay, who pioneered the implementation of coordinated fire discipline, rose to command Strategic Air Command and later served as Air Force Chief of Staff. He never forgot the lesson that proper tactics could compensate for material limitations. Throughout his career, LeMay emphasized training, discipline, and systematic problem-solving over reliance on superior technology alone. The gunners who implemented these tactics, men like Fischer and Corte and Romano, returned home after the war and rarely spoke of their experiences. They became teachers, businessmen, fathers. They raised families in the peace they had fought to secure. Most never knew that their disciplined fire had been analyzed, documented, and turned into doctrine that would influence military training for generations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The mathematics were always brutal. 10 guns, 11,000 rounds, missions lasting hours against determined enemy fighters. The numbers never changed. What changed was how American bomber crews used those numbers, not through technology or industrial might, but through coordination, communication, and trust. Through the realization that 10 men working together with discipline could achieve what 10 individuals with unlimited ammunition could not. That was the real secret the Germans never discovered. Not unlimited ammunition, but unlimited commitment to fighting as a crew. In the frozen skies over Germany, American bomber gunners learned a truth that transcends warfare. Properly coordinated, individuals achieve more than the sum of their parts. The Luftwaffe faced not American technology or American resources, but American teamwork elevated to tactical doctrine. Against that, no amount of individual German skill could prevail. The fire rotation tactics born over Schweinfurt in 1943 represented the transformation of desperate necessity into systematic advantage. And in that transformation, in the discipline of controlled fire and coordinated defense, thousands of young Americans found the difference between coming home and being lost forever in the skies over Europe.